Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and I'm going to be reading some excerpts from Annie Dillard's An American Childhood. But before I do that, I'm just going to read an excerpt from a card I wrote to my mother in 1995, which helps explain why I love being part of Portside Readers and why I love stories so much. And my mother kept every single thing I ever wrote, so that's why I get to read it again. I love the cows on this card. I imagine them as your cows when you were a little girl growing up in Plaisted. I love all the stories you told us when we were growing up about what happened when you were little. The chicken who jumped on your mother's head and didn't live to see the sunrise. The way your brothers would haul back some giant tree branch when your mother made them go get something for her to smack them with. The way you got a little toy broom set when you were 3 because you were so sick and no one thought you would survive. The way your father always sang Rosie O'Grady to your mother. The way your father always made Christmas into a treasure hunt with little notes. Your grade school teacher who really encouraged you and liked you so much. And how you had to learn English when you went to school and the rule was no French spoken. And of course, the very scary story of how you and your friend were camping out on an island and those wretched boys used combs and waxed paper to make you think wolves were after you. Those are just a few of the stories I remember. I love to have your stories as part of the very fiber of my being because your whole wonderful self is part of me. I would never become who I am today without you and Dad being who you are. All mothers and fathers should share as many stories of their own lives as possible with their children, and they should never stop. Everyone should share stories with the people they love. I think people from all parts of the world and from as far back as people existed used to realize how important stories are. That's why there were storytellers. I think stories make us feel connected to each other and to people from other times. Too many people today seem to grow up without the support, comfort, wisdom of stories. Positive, heartwarming, scary stories. Your stories are only one small reason that I thank my lucky stars that you're my mother. I love you, Karen. Okay, and now on to Annie Dillard's stories about her growing up. When I was 5, growing up in Pittsburgh in 1950, I would not go to bed willingly because something came into my room. This was a private matter between me and it. If I spoke of it, it would kill me. Who could breathe as this thing searched for me over the very corners of the room? Who could ever breathe freely again? I lay in the dark. My sister Amy, 2 years old, was asleep in the other bed. What did she know? I lay alone and was almost asleep when the damn thing entered the room by flattening itself against the open door and sliding in. It was a transparent, luminous oblong. I could see the door whiten at its touch. I could see the blue wall turn pale where it raced over it and see the headboard of Amy's bed glow. It was a swift spirit. It was an awareness. It made noise. It had 2 joined parts, a head and a tail, like a Chinese dragon. It found the door, wall, and headboard, and it swiped them, charging them with a luminous glance. After its fleet searching passage, things looked the same, but weren't. I dared not blink or breathe. I tried to hush my whooping blood. If it found another awareness, it would destroy it. Every night before it got to me, it gave up. It hit my wall's corner and couldn't get past. It shrank completely into itself and vanished like a cobra down a hole. I heard the rising roar it made when it died. I still couldn't breathe. I knew, and it was the worst fact I knew, that it could return again alive that same night. Sometimes it came back. Sometimes it didn't. Most often, restless, it came back. The light stripe slipped in the door, ran searching over Amy's wall, stopped, stretched lunatic at the first corner, raced wailing toward my wall, and vanished into the second corner with a cry. So, I wouldn't go to bed. It was a passing car whose windshield reflected the corner streetlight outside. I figured it out one night. Figuring it out was as memorable as the oblong itself. A car came roaring down hushed Edgerton Avenue in front of our house, stopped at the corner stop sign, and passed on, shrieking as its engine shifted up the gears. What precisely came into the bedroom? A reflection from the car's oblong windshield. Why did it travel in two parts? The window sash split the light and cast a shadow. Night after night, I labored up the same long chain of reasoning as night after night the thing burst into the room where I lay awake and Amy slept, and my loud heart thrashed and I froze. When the roar drew nigh and the oblong slid in the door, I started throwing my own switches for pleasure, starting out with panic and going into reasoning. It's coming after me. It's a car outside. It's after me. It's a car. It raced over the wall, lighting it blue wherever it ran, bumped over Amy's headboard in a rush, paused, and slithered elongate over the corner, shrank, flew my way, and vanished into itself with a wail. It was a car. Now, I was 12 when something sort of similar happened to me. That's why I love that story particularly. I was 12, babysitting for my sister and brother. My mother and father were out dancing. We had all gone to bed. I was lying in my bed, and I heard someone walking slowly in our backyard, up and down, up and down. And I didn't dare do anything. I just lay there in the dark thinking, okay, they're just watching the house for some reason. I don't know what it is. Somehow I fell asleep in this panic. I don't know how. When I woke up, all the lights were out, which meant that Mom and Dad were home. And I called to Dad and I said, Dad, because the noise was still happening. I said, Dad, someone is walking up and down in our backyard. And he listened for a minute and he said, Karen, that's the sheets on the line flapping. It's easy to do things like that. Okay. And now let's just see the next thing. Our parents and grandparents and all their friends seemed insensible to their own prominent defect, their limp, coarse skin. We children had, for instance, proper hands. Our fluid, pliant fingers joined the skin. Adults had misshapen, knuckly hands, loose in their skin like bones in bags. It was a wonder they could open jars. They were loose in their skins all over, like rabbits. We were whole. We were pleasing to ourselves. The skin on my mother's face was smooth, fair, and tender. It took impressions readily. She napped on her side on the couch. Her face skin pooled on the low side. It piled up in the low corners of her deep-set eyes and drew down her lips and cheeks. How flexible was it? I pushed out a puddle of it by her nose. She stirred and opened her eyes. I jumped back. She reminded me not to touch her face while she was sleeping. Anybody's face, really. Another time, I mentioned it to her. I spoke up and I told her she had a mark on her face where she'd been sleeping. Do I? She said and ran her fingers through her hair. Her hair was short, blonde, wavy. She wore it swept back from her high, curved forehead. She was not interested in the hideous mark on her face. It'll go away, I said. What? She called. At the beach, I felt my parents' shin bones. The bones were flat and curved, like the slats in a Venetian blind. The long edges were sharp as swords, but they had unexplained, and I thought, possibly diseased irregularities. Nicks, bumps, small hard balls, shallow ridges and soft spots. I was lying between my parents on an enormous towel through which I could feel the hot sand. Loose under their shin bones hung the relaxed flesh of their calves. You could push and swing this like a baby in a sling. Their heels were dry and hard, sharp at the curved edge. I would not let this happen to me. In fact, they were young. Mother was 22 when I was born and father 29. Both appeared to other adults much younger than they were. They were a handsome couple. I felt it overwhelmingly when they dressed for occasions. I never lost a wondering awe at the transformation of an everyday, tender, nap-creased mother into an exalted and dazzling beauty who chatted with me as she dressed. Her blue eyes shone and caught the light, and so did the platinum waves in her hair and the pearls at her ears and throat. She was wearing a black dress. The smooth skin on her breastbone rent my heart. It was so familiar and beloved. The black silk bodice and simple necklace set off its human fineness. Mother was perhaps a bit vain of her long and perfect legs, but not too vain for me. Despite her excited pleasure, she did not share my view of her beauty. "Look at your father," she said. We were all in the dressing room. I found him in one of the long mirrors where he waggled his out-thrust chin over the last push of his tie knot. For me, he made his ears jiggle on his skull. It was a wonder he could hear anything. His head was loose inside him. Father's enormousness was an everyday stunning fact. He was taller than everyone else. He was neither thin nor stout. His torso was supple, his long legs nimble. Before the dressing room mirror, he produced an anticipatory soft shoe and checked to see that his cuffs stayed down. Now they were off. I hoped they knocked them dead. I hoped their friends knew how witty they were and how splendid. Mother must have cut a paradoxical figure in her modernist living room with her platinum blonde hair, her brisk motions, her slender urbane frame, her ironic wit, and her wee Scotticisms. "Sit you doon," Mother said cordially to guests. If the room was too bright, she asked one of us to douse the glim. When we were babies, she bade each of us in turn, "Put your wee heady down." If no one could locate Amy when she was avoiding her nap, it was because she found herself a hidey hole. Sometimes after school, we discovered in our rooms a wee giftie. If Mother wanted a favor, she asked heart-rendingly, "Would you grant me a boon?" This was all the more remarkable because Mother was no more Scotch nor Scotch-Irish than the Pope. She was, if anyone cared to inquire, Pennsylvania Dutch and French. But the Pittsburgh in which we lived was so strongly Scotch-Irish, it might have been 17th century Donegal. Almost all the old Pittsburgh families were Scotch-Irish. Scotticisms fairly flew in the air, and Mother picked up every sort of quaint expression. She delighted in using queer nouns from the mountains, too. Her family hailed from Somerset, the mountain county near Pittsburgh, Whiskey Rebellion County. Her speech was an endlessly interesting, swerving path of old punchlines, heartfelt cri de coeur, puns new and old, dramatic true confessions, challenges, witty one-liners, wee Scotticisms, taglines from Frank Sinatra songs, obsolete mountain nouns, and moral exhortations. "I'll show him," she'd say. "I'll show him which way the bear went through the buckwheat. It'll be Katy by the door round here." "He'll be gone," Father would add wistfully, "where the woodbine twineth." Mother woke Amy and me in the mornings by dashing into our room, wrenching aside the window curtains, cranking open our old leaded windows, shouting mysteriously, "It smells like a French whorehouse in here," and dashing out. When we got downstairs, we might find her, that same morning, sitting half asleep, crumpled of skin in her soft bathrobe, staring at her foot in its slipper, even with her eyes closed. If we began to whisper, we soon heard her murmur affectionately, if unconvincingly, "I am awake." She moved vigorously, laughed easily, spoke rapidly and boldly, and analyzed with restless force. Her moods shifted. Her utterances changed key and pitch. She was fond of ending any long explanation with the sudden puzzling kicker, "And that's why I can't imitate 4 Hawaiians." She stroked our heads tenderly, called each of us a dozen endearing names. She thrilled, apparently, to tales of our adventures and admired inordinately our drawings and forts. She taught us to curtsy. She taught us to play poker. This last little excerpt I'm also particularly fond of because when I was 10, I decided that I was so happy being 10, I did not need to get any older. This is Karen. I just thought 10, perfect age. I don't need to get any older. This is Annie when she was 10. In 1955, when I was 10, my father's reading went to his head. My father's reading during that time, and for many years before and after, consisted, for the most part, of life on the Mississippi. He was a young executive in the old family firm, American Standard. Sometimes he traveled alone on business. Traveling, he checked into a hotel, found a bookstore, and chose for the night's reading, after what I fancy to have been long deliberation, yet another copy of Life on the Mississippi. He brought all these books home. There were dozens of copies of Life on the Mississippi on the living room shelves. From time to time, I read one. When all this reading went to Father's head, he took action. From Pittsburgh, he went down the river. Although no one else that our family knew kept a boat on the Allegheny, our father did. And now he was going all the way with it. He quit the firm his great-grandfather had founded 100 years earlier. He was taking off for New Orleans. New Orleans was the source of the music he loved, Dixieland jazz. In New Orleans, men would blow it in the air and beat it underfoot. The music that hustled and snapped, and the music whose zip matched his when he was a man about town at home in Pittsburgh, working for the family firm. The music he tapped his foot to when he was a man about town in New York, for a few years after college, working for the family firm by day, and by night, hanging out at Jimmy Ryan's on 52nd Street with Zooty Singleton, the black drummer who befriended him, and the rest of the house band. Back in New Orleans, where he was headed, they would play the old stuff, the hot, rough stuff, bastardized for tourists maybe, but still the big and muddy source of it all. Getting ready for the trip one Saturday, he roamed around our big brick house, snapping his fingers. He put a record on, Little Liza Jane. I was reading Robert Louis Stevenson on the sun porch, Kidnapped. I looked up from my book and saw him outside. He had wandered out to the lawn and was standing in the wind between the buckeye trees and looking up at what must have been a small patch of wild sky. Old Low Pockets. He was 6'4", all lanky and leggy. He had thick brown hair and shaggy brows and a mild, dreamy expression in his blue eyes. While I was reading Kidnapped on this Saturday morning, I heard him come inside and roam from the kitchen to the pantry, to the bar, to the dining room, the living room, and the sun porch, snapping his fingers. He was snapping the fingers of both hands and shaking his head to Little Liza Jane, the sound that was beating big and jivey all over the house. He walked lightly, long-legged, like a soft shoe hoofer, barely in touch with the floor. A week later, he bade a cheerful farewell to us, to Mother, who had encouraged him, to us oblivious daughters, 10 and 7, and the new baby girl, 6 months old. He loaded his 24-foot cabin cruiser with canned food, pushed off from the dock of the wretched boat club that Mother hated, and pointed his bow downstream down the Allegheny River. From there, it was only a few miles to the Ohio River at Pittsburgh's Point, where the Monongahela came in. He wore on westward down the Ohio. By day, he rode through locks. He conversed with locks masters, those lone men who paced silhouetted in overalls on the concrete lock chamber walls. "Hello up there! So long down there!" He continued down the river along the Kentucky border with Ohio, bumping through the locks. It was a long way to New Orleans. At this rate, another couple of months. He was finding the river lonesome. It got dark too early. It was September. There were no old salts on the dock talking river talk. From phone booths all down the Ohio River, he talked to Mother. She told him that she was lonesome too, and that 3 children were a handful. She said further that people were starting to talk. She knew Father couldn't bear people talking. For all his dreaminess, he prized respectability above all. After only 6 weeks then, on the Ohio River at Louisville, he sold the boat and came home. I was just waking up then, just barely. Other things were changing. Children 10 years old wake up and find themselves here, discover themselves to have been here all along. They wake like sleepwalkers, in full stride. They wake like people brought back from cardiac arrest or from drowning, surrounded by familiar objects and people, equipped with 100 skills. They know the neighborhood. They can read and write English. They are old hands at the commonplace mysteries, and yet they feel themselves to have just stepped off the boat, just converged with their bodies, just flown down from a trance to lodge in an eerily familiar life already well underway. I was 10 years old now, up into the double numbers, where I would likely remain till I died. I am awake now forever, I thought suddenly. I have converged with myself in the present. My hands were icy from holding Kidnapped up. I always read lying down. I felt time in full stream, and I felt consciousness in full stream joining it, like the river.